And you facilitate it first.
Yeah.
You guys are not like this with this. Yeah.
So the idea there is to give you a sense. First of all, you should feel a little uncomfortable. Like that's the idea. We're preparing you for an uncomfortable situation. But it's also to give you a sense that every patient's going to have their own comfort zone. Some patients are going to be really comfortable getting right up in your face, and some patients aren't going to tolerate you getting anywhere close to them for various reasons. So to respect the fact that it's going to be a fluid situation. Just because a patient's coming at you, like you should be aware of your own comfort zone. Like I said, take your own pulse. If you don't feel calm or relaxed with the patient because they're too close to you, then that's up to you to get to that position where you feel safe and comfortable so you can provide the best possible care. You can even say that. Like sometimes I find that the honest truth is the easiest thing to say. Like, look, right now I'm not feeling comfortable. You're a little close to me. A lot of times patients will either respect that, or if they start testing that limit, then that's also important information to know. Make sense? Okay. So we're going to get into some of this is sort of the theory of what we're working with, and I think if you have a sense of this, the theory, then you'll be able to adapt and improvise as you need. We'll get into some specifics with verbal de-escalation. But the idea is that we're trying to develop you can't take care of a patient that you don't like, or you can't take care of them well. If you feel like they are deliberately trying to manipulate you, if you feel like they're trying to take advantage of the situation, if you feel like they are being lazy or obstinate, you're not going to be able to provide good care to them. So this is a framework that I find, at least for me, helps me get in the patient's position so I can at least provide good care for them and protect myself. I see all of us, every person, and this is to Gibran's point, where a lot of our patients already have psychiatric follow-up. They're between two places. They have the reserves that are keeping their head above water, so to speak, and they have the stressors, which threaten to overwhelm them. I think everyone in this room can easily think of the top three, whether it's family, work, finances. These are things that we're trying to navigate in our life. And the reserves are the things like our family support, physical health, education, our thinking, our thought process, our logic, that helps us reason and rationalize our way to get through the situation. For our patients, you can imagine a whole host of things that wears away the reserves. The chemo brain that limits their attention span, the caretakers who are getting burnt out and can no longer really provide support, or they might create more aggravation. And then the stressors start to build, like a combination of physiologic, emotional, existential. Like, why am I doing? Every patient I think that I've encountered has at one point wondered, what's the point of this? Why am I going through this? In addition to fatigue, anemia, everything that we're used to assessing. So everything we're doing, we're reducing the stress and bolstering reserves. So what are the actual behaviors you're going to see? It's important to recognize that it's not an all or nothing phenomenon. They're not either agitated or calm. Like I was saying, there might even be simmering, brewing, anxiety, leading them to the counseling center outpatient. It's just like a harbinger of like this raging delirium that's about to emerge. So you can think at our best, we're adaptive. We have high reserves, low stress. We're able to navigate the field. And at our worst, we're actually dangerous. That's when the stress levels are so high or with the reserves worn out.
And it's so interesting. I just want to add, like, as these behaviors, that trigger BRT, and the more serious ones, it sort of affects the frontline staff where they start getting stressed out, and they may be out of the stress, maybe flustered or behaving in a certain manner. So it's really our job also is to kind of help calm them down, give them direction, de-escalate them as well. I mean, I've kind of noticed that from some of the more serious calls. I feel like the staff is very anxious. They want to take care of the patient. They want to make sure that they do the right thing. So we have to give them direction.
Yeah, look, everyone in our hospital is somewhere on the spectrum, and that not just patients. Everyone in this room is somewhere on the spectrum right now. I don't know where I'm at right now. I know I'm stressed out because I need to get this done in time because I have 5 minutes left. I got some reserves with the coffee, but that's pretty much it. But I'm somewhere in here. I'm not danger to myself yet. Run out of this room against medical advice. And so everything we're doing is, and I want to go back to this idea of our head below water. Is anyone here lifeguarded or actually drowned themselves or played water polo or anything? I played water polo. You did drown. Yeah, you're here. So the experience of drowning is really unlike anything else. Basically all of your frontal lobe shuts down and you're overwhelmed. And what they teach you as a lifeguard is that you can't swim out to that patient without a flotation device, because you will become a flotation device. Like, they don't see you as a person, they see you as something to push down, because it's just your pure animal instinct at that point. Everything we're doing is, every behavior we have, wherever we are, it's our ultimate goal and directive is to soothe ourselves so we can have some sense of control, so we can get our head above the water. And we want to do that in a way where we're not being submerged by the patient as well. To Javon's point, like, the staff is often being swallowed up by this. And I mentioned that it's also a way to elicit empathy. These aren't patients that are deliberately acting in a way that's malicious or vindictive. They're just acting out of instinct to get better themselves. And the dominant mood to really consider is fear. So if people are afraid, why are they throwing punches? Why are they throwing objects? Well, anger is one way of dealing with fear. We fight it. We harm ourselves, or a lot of our patients harm themselves because they feel like they can't escape it, when they feel like the threat is inescapable. Most of my patients who completed suicide in my residency, most of them were psychotic. They weren't depressed necessarily. They were just overwhelmed with this paranoid delusions, a nightmare that they couldn't escape. And it's important to recognize the more distress, the less effective our behavior. So I go through this sequence of examples, again, designed to sort of elicit some sense of sympathy and for you to do a checklist of yourself, what you do. So when we're effective, we're doing things like meeting friends, improving our diet, exercise, organizing ourselves, our lives. We start developing what we call maladaptive coping. We get this temporary relief, this temporary kick, but that's just, it's like a Band-Aid. The bad situation only gets worse. Idea like Law and Order. A lot of our patients watch Law and Order because you can, at any point of day, like, you know it's on, you know where you are, you don't have to follow closely. It's like iced tea at a certain point, make some comment, and you know you're getting close to when the court session is in session, and you start watching it. Myself. Patients Googling, they get some sense of control, temporary. Thinking becomes more rigid, obsessive. You can think of depressive thinking as highly rigid thinking. I'm just this constant beating thought, like I'm just a piece of shit, I'm worthless. Again, they're still functioning, keeping their heads above water, but they're starting to sink. And then typically when we start seeing patients, it's when they've now dipped to the point where they're in this red zone, they've lost touch with reality, either from physiological or sometimes even to the point of just severe distress will get them to this point. That's when they develop delusions, hallucinations. They can't really test the reality around them. Maybe like paranoia of like someone using marijuana or that mild opiate-induced delirium where they can see things no one else can see, but they're still acting relatively calm. And finally, like this point where I was talking about when that drowning sensation comes, when everything shuts down in your front part of your brain and you're just left with that reptilian caveman brain that is just thrashing around and doing whatever you can to give yourself some temporary sense of control, even though it's profoundly destructive. I don't know, people see maybe Montefiore, you might have seen a couple cases of PCP. It's one of those drugs that I have a hard time getting like what the appeal is, but I remember a consult when I was a resident where I was called to assess capacity for a woman who was high on PCP and delivery, and they wanted to see if she could capacity to have the epidural. And when I showed up, I saw she was having active contractions on the tachometer, and she was passed out. And I said, "What did you give her?" They didn't give her anything. She was just in this lull of the PCP, and the flip side of that is I've had patients that were restrained, seemingly they're left in the room by themselves, and then you could hear the thunk going down the hallway as they like lifted the stretcher and moved it bit by bit down the hallway. So it's amazing what the brain can do. But that's just an example. You can think of all your clinical experiences and think, oh, where was the patient in that situation? The idea, part of the goal of bringing up this strategy is not for you guys to remember what maladaptive or just thinking, but it's just this general sense of, okay, where am I? And that's going to be where your treatment is directed. It's unfortunate, I think a lot of the times when people show up to the scene, they're trying to calm and debate or rationalize with someone who is now like completely in this danger zone of this red or darker area. They're just not going to be able to hear it. And it's frustrating for them, for the patients, and it's dangerous. So you can only really problem solve when they're relatively functional and they have some executive functioning. They can only really hear limits once they have some degree of rationality. But if they have no sense of reality, they're not going to see you as a ally or someone who can help them. They're just going to see you as an adversary. They won't respond well to limit setting. So that's where we get this idea of verbal de-escalation, which is basically joining with the patient, giving them a sense that you are there with them, that you aren't there in opposition, but you're part of there to provide a flotation device of support, as opposed to another person just trying to keep them down when they're already feeling overwhelmed. And ultimately, you'll get a sense pretty quickly if they're not able to engage, they're going to need some neuroleptics or sedatives, and Dr. Breitbart will get into that later what those include or what we recommend. And finally, physical restraint for those patients who are just completely disorganized, dysregulated. They need time to metabolize medications. This gets to your point. I think it's important that when there's a crisis situation, we act as a team. Oftentimes, the patient will get better into this area, but then dip back down. It's important that everyone gets together and kind of contribute what their experience was, what they thought helped, what they thought didn't help, because inevitably this patient is going to dip down. Their stresses are going to build up again. We want a plan in place to anticipate, keep them level, and the goal is reach some sort of equilibrium over time. So I'll give the basic principles of verbal de-escalation.
This is like the meat of like what you'll be doing at the VRTs, especially for the ICU APPs, like what Andrew's going to go over.
Yeah.
The verbal de-escalation strategies.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's going to be pretty brief, but the fortunate thing is we're going to practice. This is really the best way to learn this is to practice it with the patient actors. So like I said, the goal of de-escalation is, again, remind yourself this is a person who already feels like they're drowning. If you're another person putting your hand on their shoulder, you're just going to be another person they're going to experience holding them down. So you want to get them to realize that you're on the same wavelength. So the way we do that is we validate the emotions, we don't get stuck in the facts. People will be hurling accusations, like I said, people might even be saying awful things. The important thing is you can say, look, that's terrifying, even if you don't agree what they're terrified of is real. It's not your job to talk them out of what is or isn't real. You want to maintain some neutrality too. You don't want to be overly effusive. You don't want to be overly sympathetic. If someone is paranoid especially, because they'll take that, what's in it for this person? Why this person? I have no idea. Why are they all of a sudden trying to be my best friend? What's in it for them? So it's a balance. But to remind yourself, if you can't get answers, you can get an understanding of what they're going through. So they want to know why they're still there. They want to know why they can't leave. And you might not know what they're saying. You might not have that sense. But you can at least say, look, and you can be honest with them at that time. You can say, look, I hate the idea that I'm keeping you against your will. That is the last thing I want to be doing. I will try to figure out why you're being kept here, but in the meantime, I understand or maybe I can't imagine how, sometimes people don't like hearing that you understand. Sometimes it's better just to say, I can't imagine what it's like going through this, to feel disempowered, to feel like you have no control. So in that vein, you want to give that patient some control. Like that patient I mentioned who had the tubes in, in some ways it was helpful for him to know that even though he was surrounded by all these people in this strange place that he didn't trust, he at least had some sense of control. Whether that he could move around the floor, move around the room, whatever the case, it's up to you though to really clearly set the limits while giving them a sense of autonomy and space. And that means knowing what you can and can't offer. if the person's wanting to leave, it's very tempting just to say, oh yeah, well, you'll be discharged in the morning, we just need to get to the morning. But if you can't offer that, I wouldn't give that. That's not something, even though it feels like you're giving them some autonomy, you're establishing a limit that's not reasonable. It can be helpful to give them permission to what they're already doing. If they're moving around the room, say, okay, can you walk it out, walk it out. A lot of times with our patients in the stimulated rooms, that you can tell right away everyone wants the person to sit. Like they're just doing everything they can to tell the person to sit because it's uncomfortable. But if that's what they're doing to discharge energy, my recommendation is to let them do it if you feel safe, unless they're coming at you, in which case that's the limit. But I wouldn't, the idea is that they have their space and they're doing their thing, and to let them do that. Limits in order to work need to be simple, consistent, enforceable. You can't say if you leave the room it'll be a big problem. Or you can say that it might not be necessarily heard or effective, but if you say if you leave this line right here, we're going to have security escort you back in. That's just the rule, that's how it is, it's not personal, I'm just doing my job. And that's a clear, consistent limit that you can enforce. Ideally with a clear, immediate consequences. It's hard for someone, like I said, when you lose executive function, you lose your ability to plan ahead. So if someone is really in this state, in this distressed state, telling them that they might have an issue 2 or 3 months down the line, or if they get home, they might have developed a pulmonary embolism. That's not something that they can really wrap their head around. But if you can say very clearly, if you leave this hospital, we're going to have to call NYPD, or we're going to have to call security, that's something they can, very concrete that they can see and hear. So 3 just basic strategies, ranging from the most basic and simple reflection. Sometimes the easiest thing you can do is just feed the patient back what they're telling you, not necessarily parroting them, but just as much of their words that they're using, you give back to them. If they're standing, you stand. If they're sitting, you sit. So it works with body language too. It gets them, it's a very primitive way of giving them a sense you're on their side. Following that, there's emotion naming. I like to go over, and this is what I was saying with my wife, of like a medical school thing, that even when my wife knows it as a trick, like she's okay with it. Just naming emotions without euphemisms. Like if someone is clearly angry or pissed off, don't say I can understand it's a little annoying. Our tendency sometimes is to tamper down. I like to go over the top and let the patient correct me. Like, you didn't get your tray today? That is infuriating. I can't believe that. That's awful. And then maybe they'll say, oh, it's not that bad. But then they'll try to de-escalate you sometimes. But try to avoid saying that it's annoying, or or worst of all, saying like that's not that big of a deal.
You want to be genuine. Like whatever you say, it has to come off genuine.
Just off the cuff, I mean, what's the word, I'll bring it to the room, what's the worst thing someone can tell you when you're feeling panicky or anxious?
Chill, relax.
Chill, don't panic, relax, right.
It's okay.
It's okay. Why, what's wrong with that? I mean, they want you to be relaxed.
It's invalidating.
Yeah. Like basically you're saying like if you're in this herd, like this is a member of the herd who is acting out of control, we want everyone to be calm for the sake, not for their sake, but just for the sake of the hospital, of the floor. And that's why a lot of patients say very frequently, oh, you're just worried about my suicidality because it's legally required to ask these questions. But if before you get to those questions, you give them a sense that you're actually hearing what they're saying, that works for ourselves too. We always tell ourselves to cut it out or calm down, but you actually have to hear what you're going through in order to genuinely be able to tell. And that gets to this question of is it genuine or not. You can only really help someone calm down if you're there with them and understand what they're going through. And so that's what these steps are for. This final step, clarification, is that next step requires a little bit more functioning on the patient's part, but really curious, okay, so when you threw the tray, what did you think would happen? Like, tell me, were you hoping this would get you what you needed? And walk me through this, because I want to be there and do the process. And you might be able to walk them through that. Sometimes they might turn back and get hostile very quickly, abruptly, and you flow with that, you go back and forth. But the idea is these are mapped out to where the patient is. Some patients, they can only really tolerate just you talking, letting them know that you hear them. And some patients, they might be a little bit more functional or right on the precipice of getting worse, and they can tolerate clarification. So I'll give a final list of examples, and we could do a quick break and then get the actors in so we can practice this. You walk in, the patient right away demands that you leave. All right, you want me to leave? Would be an example of sort of reflection. But you're just telling the person what they're hearing. Yeah, it's so frustrating. It's really shitty. It's so dehumanizing or infantilizing when you have no control over who comes and goes. I like to say, like, tell patients, that's the one thing you should have is that ability to control. So that's one way you could do some emotion naming, like put a name to what they're going through, if they can hear that. Clarifying would be, all right, I see you don't want to talk to me. We don't have to talk. You have that right. Just before I go, can you at least explain why you don't want to talk to me? And that's sort of trying to get some clarification. Sometimes it's a way of taking it from like an interpersonal, so it's less intense. It's just, and you're just trying to get clarity, and often that'll lead into maybe they're paranoid, maybe they just don't trust you, maybe they're sick of doctors. And this is what I give as an example of sort of limit setting, and we talked about this before, the airport example. Like, we all can sympathize with the process of going to the airport, but there's just very clear limits, right? It's really shitty. You want to leave, your last thing you want to do is talk to another person. This is just, I'm here doing my job. I think, again, to be honest and open to that person, saying, look, I don't want to keep you here anymore. I'm here to do my job, and that's to make sure you're safe. But it's like going through airport security. The more we can do this, like, if we can do this, if we can have this conversation, then I'll get you to the next step, which is getting out of here. You're setting the limits, like you have to talk to me in order to get out. And in a way that's very concrete and clear, they have to have some capacity to hear that. They can't be too delirious or confused for that to really drive with them. Make sense? All right, we can do questions later, but I want to make sure you guys get a break and get a break too.
Yeah, very quick, 2-minute break. Just, but before we have a break, just we're gonna have 3 simulated scenarios today. So I'm gonna pair up everybody. So the first